In fact, have you ever wondered why the person who betrayed you seems unable to move forward, stuck, restless, and hollow, while you are slowly reclaiming your strength? It's not because they are unaffected. It's because avoidance is a prison disguised as freedom, and the soul always knows when it has abandoned the truth. Avoidant psychology is not merely a pattern of behavior, it is a spiritual conflict within the human heart. When someone betrays you, they don't just break trust, they break alignment with their own inner truth. And the avoidant mind cannot survive in the presence of truth, so it runs. Avoidant individuals do not lack intelligence or emotion. What they lack is the courage to sit with the weight of what they have done. Betrayal creates an inner fracture, a split between who they believe they are and what they have proven themselves capable of. Instead of healing that fracture through accountability, they choose distance, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much, and do not know how to face it. Avoidance is the refusal to remain present with discomfort, and healing only happens in presence. This is why they cannot recover. They keep moving, distracting, numbing, rationalizing, yet the soul cannot be fooled. The conscience does not forget. The heart records everything. You see, guilt that is not transformed becomes a weight. Shame that is not acknowledged becomes a wall. And when someone betrays you and avoids responsibility, they begin living behind that wall. They may appear calm, detached, even thriving, but inside there is stagnation. No growth, no peace, only repetition. They often rewrite the story to survive. They minimize the damage. They shift blame. They convince themselves that you were too much, too sensitive, too demanding. But this narrative is not for you, it is for them. It is the mind's last attempt to escape the soul's call to truth. Divine wisdom teaches us that restoration requires confession, humility, and surrender, not to an other person, but to truth itself. And avoidant psychology rejects surrender. It believes control is safety. Distance is protection. Silence is power. But these are illusions. True strength is the willingness to stay, to feel remorse without collapsing, to admit wrong without self-destruction, to face the pain you caused and allow it to refine you rather than define you. Avoidant individuals resist this process, and so they remain emotionally unfinished and unable to access deep connection, unable to experience real peace. And here is the sacred lesson for you. Their inability to recover is not evidence of your failure. It is confirmation of your integrity. While they run from the lesson, you integrate it. While they suppress, you transform. While they avoid, you awaken. Healing favors the brave. Growth follows truth. And the soul that chooses accountability always rises, while the soul that avoids remains restless, no matter how far it runs. Avoidant individuals fear emotional accountability, expect more than loss, because accountability requires them to remain present with the truth of who they have been and what they have done. Loss to them is external. It can be rationalized, minimized, or replaced. Emotional accountability, however, is internal. It demands self-examination, humility, and the willingness to endure discomfort without escaping. For the avoidant mind, this feels far more threatening than walking away from a relationship, a bond, or even a future they once claimed to value. Loss allows avoidance to stay intact. When something is lost, the avoidant person can tell themselves the story that it was inevitable, mutual, or necessary. They can grieve selectively, focusing on what they gave up rather than what they damaged. Accountability strips away that comfort. It removes the protective layers of justification and exposes the raw truth. I chose this. I caused this. I am responsible. That moment of clarity is terrifying to someone whose nervous system is wired to, in fact, flee emotional intensity. Avoidant psychology is deeply rooted in self-protection. Many avoidant individuals learned early in life that vulnerability leads to overwhelm, rejection, or shame. As a result, they built an identity around emotional independence and control. Accountability threatens that identity. It requires admitting that their actions mattered, that they affected someone deeply, and that they are not as detached or self-sufficient as they pretend to be. To an avoidant person, this feels like losing control of the self, not just facing a mistake. This is why they can tolerate loss but not reflection. Walking away keeps their internal world stable. Looking inward destabilizes it. Emotional accountability forces them to confront guilt without escaping into distraction, denial, or blame shifting. It asks them to stay with the discomfort long enough for transformation to occur. But avoidance is built on the belief that discomfort is dangerous, not instructive. So instead of anging into responsibility, they retreat into emotional distance. Betrayal intensifies this fear. When an avoidant person betrays someone, the internal conflict becomes unavoidable. They must either integrate the truth of their behavior or fragment further. Many choose fragmentation. They compartmentalize the betrayal, sealing it off from their conscious identity. They convince themselves it wasn't that bad, or that circumstances forced their hand. This psychological maneuver protects them from immediate shame, but it also blocks growth. Accountability would require them to feel remorse without self-defense. It would require them to acknowledge the pain they caused without justifying it. For the avoidant, this level of emotional exposure feels unbearable. It threatens their carefully constructed emotional armor. Loss, on the other hand, reinforces it. Loss confirms their belief that attachment is unsafe and closeness is costly. In this way, walking away feels familiar, even validating. In fact, ironically, by choosing loss over accountability, avoidant individuals imprison themselves. They avoid the short-term pain of self-confrontation but inherit long-term emotional stagnation. Without accountability, there is no integration. Without integration, there is no healing. They may move on physically, socially, or romantically, but internally they remain unchanged, repeating the same patterns under different circumstances. Emotional accountability is not about punishment, it is about alignment. It is the bridge between who someone was and who they could become. Avoidant individuals fear crossing that bridge because it requires them to stand still long enough to feel what they have been running from. And until they are willing to do that, loss will always feel safer than truth. When betrayal occurs, it does more than rupture a relationship, it fractures the betrayer's internal identity. Avoidant individuals often rely on a carefully maintained self-image, one that portrays them as, reasonable, controlled, and emotionally self-sufficient. Betrayal shatters that image. It confronts them with evidence that their actions contradict the person they believe themselves to be. This inner contradiction is deeply unsettling, especially for someone who avoids emotional complexity rather than engaging with it. The avoidant psyche depends on coherence. It needs a clean narrative. I am not the kind of person who causes harm, or I do what I must to protect myself. Betrayal introduces dissonance into that narrative. Suddenly, they are forced to acknowledge that they hurt someone who trusted them. That realization is not just about guilt, it is about identity collapse. The mind scrambles to restore balance, not by healing, but by defending the self-image at all costs. This is why avoidance intensifies after betrayal. Instead of processing remorse, the avoidant individual distances themselves from the person, the memory, and even the emotions tied to the event. They may appeal, are indifferent or detached, but this detachment is a survival response. Remaining emotionally engaged would require them to sit with the fracture long enough to integrate it. Integration demands humility, vulnerability, and emotional presence, qualities the avoidant nervous system is not trained to sustain. Rather than repairing the inner split, they attempt to seal it. They suppress the parts of themselves associated with the betrayal and double down on emotional distance. Over time, this creates a fragmented sense of self. One part of them knows the truth of what happened. Another part denies its significance. Living in this internal divide is exhausting, but it feels safer than facing the full weight of responsibility. Avoidant individuals often confuse self-protection with self-preservation. In protecting their image, they believe they are safeguarding their stability. In reality, they are destabilizing their inner world. A fractured identity cannot rest. It requires constant distraction, constant movement, and constant justification to keep the truth from surfacing. This is why many avoidant betrayers struggle with restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction, or emotional numbness long after the relationship ends. The inability to integrate betrayal into their self-concept prevents genuine growth. Growth requires acknowledging not only what was done, but what it reveals about unmet needs, unhealed wounds, and maladaptive coping strategies. For the avoidant individual, this level of self-examination feels like an existential threat. If they allow the fracture to be seen, they fear they will collapse under its weight. Yet the fracture itself is not the danger. The refusal to tend to it is. When betrayal is not integrated, it becomes a hidden fault line within the personality. It influences future relationships, reinforcing patterns of emotional withdrawal, defensiveness, and self-sabotage. The avoidant person may appear composed on the surface, but internally they are disconnected from their own emotional truth. Healing would require them to accept that they are both capable of harm and capable of growth. This duality is essential for wholeness. But avoidant psychology resists duality. It prefers simplicity over truth, distance over depth, and control over connection. As a result, the fracture remains unresolved, quietly shaping their inner life and relationships, while the opportunity for genuine integration passes by untouched. Avoidance is often mistaken for strength because it looks composed, controlled, and unbothered. In reality, it is a defense built to shield the individual from emotional exposure, not a reflection of resilience or inner power. When someone avoids, they are not demonstrating mastery over emotion, they are signaling an inability to remain present with it. True strength requires the capacity to feel deeply without fleeing, to endure discomfort without collapsing, and to face the consequences of one's actions with clarity and humility. Avoidant behavior emerges from a nervous system that has learned to associate emotional closeness with danger. At some point, vulnerability became overwhelming, unsafe, or shaming. To survive, the individual learned to suppress emotional responses and retreat into distance. Over time, this strategy becomes habitual and even admired. Society often rewards emotional detachment, mistaking it for independence or self-control. But detachment is not the same as regulation. One is a shutdown, the other is integration. When betrayal occurs, avoidance intensifies. Instead of facing the pain they caused or the discomfort of remorse, the avoidant individual disengages. They may withdraw, go silent, or act indifferent. To an observer, this can look like emotional strength, they moved on so quickly, or they're not affected. But internally, this is not peace. It is suppression. And what is suppressed does not disappear, it waits. Avoidance as a defense functions by narrowing awareness. In fact, the individual limits what they feel, think, and acknowledge in order to maintain internal stability. This narrowing creates an illusion of control. However, control achieved through avoidance is fragile. It depends on constant distance from triggers, emotions, and accountability. The moment those barriers are challenged, the inner structure begins to shake. True strength expands awareness rather than shrinking it. It allows space for grief, guilt, remorse, and responsibility without self-destruction. Avoidant individuals fear that if they allow themselves to feel fully, they will be overwhelmed. This fear keeps them locked in a defensive posture, always bracing, always guarded. Over time, this defense becomes exhausting, even if they are unaware of it. The paradox of avoidance is that it promises safety but delivers stagnation. While the avoidant individual may avoid immediate pain, they also avoid growth. Emotional muscles are built through use, not avoidance. Each time they retreat forward, affect ROM accountability or emotional depth, they reinforce the belief that they are incapable of handling it. This belief further entrenches the defensive pattern. Avoidance also distorts self-perception. By equating distance with strength, the individual never learns what they are truly capable of enduring. They underestimate their resilience because they have never tested it. They remain emotionally underdeveloped, not because they lack capacity, but because they have not allowed themselves to engage with it. In the context of betrayal, this defense prevents healing. Healing requires facing discomfort with honesty and presence. Avoidance blocks this process, leaving unresolved emotions to surface in indirect ways: irritability, numbness, restlessness, or repeated relational failures. What looks like strength on the surface is often a silent struggle underneath. Strength is not the absence of emotion, it is the ability to hold emotion without being controlled by it. Avoidance avoids this level. In fact, SS on entirely. It protects the individual from feeling weak, but in doing so, it keeps them from becoming strong. Avoidant individuals often mistake emotional distance for emotional safety, believing that the farther they stay from intimacy, vulnerability, and accountability, the less likely they are to be hurt or overwhelmed. This belief is not rooted in truth, but in learned survival. At some point in their development, closeness became associated with pain, loss of control, or emotional flooding. Distance then became a coping mechanism, a way to regulate an internal world that felt too intense to manage directly. Emotional distance creates a temporary sense of calm. When an avoidant person withdraws, the nervous system experiences relief. There are fewer demands, fewer emotional cues to process, and less risk of exposure. This relief is interpreted as safety. But safety achieved through withdrawal is conditional. It depends entirely on the absence of emotional engagement. The moment affect closeness is reintroduced, the same anxiety resurfaces, reinforcing the belief that distance is necessary. True emotional safety, however, is not the absence of connection, it is the ability to remain regulated within connection. Avoidant individuals do not develop this capacity because they consistently remove themselves from emotionally charged situations, instead of learning how to stay present within them. Over time, they confuse avoidance with self-care and withdrawal with boundaries, even when those behaviors undermine intimacy and trust. This confusion becomes especially pronounced after betrayal. Emotional distance feels like a solution. By pulling away, the avoidant individual avoids confronting guilt, remorse, and the pain they caused. They also avoid the vulnerability required to repair or even reflect. The silence and detachment may look peaceful, but internally it is a controlled shutdown. The nervous system is not healed, it is numbed. Distance also provides a sense of superiority or control. When someone disengages, they feel less dependent and less exposed. This reinforces the illusion that they are strong, unaffected, and self-contained. In reality, this posture is defensive. It protects the individual from emotional discomfort, but also blocks access to intimacy, empathy, and authentic connection. Over time, reliance on emotional distance erodes the ability to feel safe with others. The avoidant person becomes comfortable only in isolation or superficial interaction. Deeper connection triggers anxiety rather than comfort. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Distance reduces anxiety temporarily, which strengthens the belief that closeness is dangerous. The individual never learns that safety can exist within emotional engagement because they never stay long enough to experience it. Emotional distance also fragments relationships. Partners, friends, or loved ones may sense the withdrawal and feel rejected or confused. Attempts to reconnect may be with further distancing, creating a dynamic where the avoidant person feels increasingly justified in their withdrawal. See, they tell themselves, closeness always leads to conflict. What they fail to see is that the conflict arises not from closeness itself, but from the absence of emotional presence. True safety requires emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, tolerate, and communicate feelings without shutting down. Avoidant individuals bypass this learning by relying on distance. As a result, their sense of safety is fragile and easily disrupted. It depends on control rather than trust, avoidance rather than resilience. The tragedy of this pattern is that emotional distance protects the avoidant individual from immediate discomfort but deprives them of long-term security. Real safety is built through consistency, honesty, and emotional engagement. By confusing distance with safety, the avoidant individual remains guarded, disconnected, and perpetually unsatisfied, never. In fact, realizing that what they fear most, closeness, is also the path to genuine peace. Healing requires presence, and presence is exactly what the avoidant individual resists most. Presence means staying emotionally available when discomfort arises, remaining mentally engaged when guilt surfaces, and allowing oneself to feel without immediately escaping. For the avoidant psyche, this feels unnatural and even threatening. Their nervous system has been conditioned to associate emotional intensity with danger, so the instinctive response is to withdraw, distract, or disconnect the moment vulnerability appears. Presence demands stillness. It asks a person to pause rather than flee, to listen inwardly rather than drown out internal signals. Avoidant individuals struggle with stillness because stillness brings awareness. In awareness, unresolved emotions rise to the surface: shame, regret, fear, grief. These feelings have often been suppressed for years. When presence is required, it can feel like opening a door to a flood they fear will overwhelm them. Avoidance, by contrast, feels efficient. It offers immediate relief. By disengaging, the avoidant person lowers emotional arousal and regains a sense of control. This reinforces the belief that avoidance works. What they fail to recognize is that relief is not resolution. Presence is the only state in which emotional processing can occur. Without it, emotions remain unintegrated, lingering beneath the surface and influencing behavior indirectly. After betrayal, presence becomes even more critical. Healing would require the avoidant individual to sit with the reality of their actions and the impact those actions had on another person. This level of engagement requires emotional courage. It means tolerating remorse without defensiveness, listening without justifying, and acknowledging harm without minimizing it. For someone whose primary coping mechanism is disengagement, this feels like an unbearable demand. Presence also dismantled, affect ease illusion. When an avoidant person stays present, they can no longer hide behind narratives that protect their self-image. They must confront the full complexity of the situation, their motives, their fears, their choices. This confrontation is not punishment, it is integration. But integration requires the willingness to be seen by oneself first and, at times, by others. Avoidant psychology resists being seen because visibility feels like exposure. Many avoidant individuals equate presence with weakness. They believe that if they allow themselves to feel fully, they will lose control or collapse emotionally. This belief keeps them in a perpetual state of guardedness. Yet presence does not require emotional flooding. It requires regulation, the ability to remain connected to oneself while emotions move through. Because avoidant individuals have not practiced this skill, they assume it is impossible. Healing unfolds slowly and quietly. It happens in moments of reflection, accountability, respect why, and emotional honesty. These moments cannot occur while running. Presence is the ground on which healing stands. Without it, insight remains intellectual, not embodied. Change becomes theoretical rather than lived. Avoidant resistance to presence often shows up as busyness, distraction, or emotional numbness. They may fill their lives with activity, stimulation, or new attachments to avoid sitting with themselves. But the inner world cannot be outrun. What is avoided accumulates, creating an undercurrent of restlessness or dissatisfaction that never fully resolves. Presence would allow the avoidant individual to discover that emotions are not threats but messages. That guilt can lead to growth. That discomfort can refine rather than destroy. But this discovery requires staying instead of leaving, feeling instead of numbing, and facing instead of fleeing. Until presence is embraced, healing remains inaccessible. The avoidant individual may appear functional, even successful, but empty. In fact, rurally, they remain unfinished. Healing does not meet us in escape. It meets us where we are willing to stay. Guilt that is not processed does not fade with time, it hardens. When left unacknowledged and unfelt, guilt does not transform into wisdom or accountability, it turns into emotional paralysis. For avoidant individuals, guilt is especially threatening because it demands emotional presence and moral reflection, two experiences they are conditioned to evade. Rather than engaging with guilt directly, they suppress it, hoping distance will dissolve it. Instead, it settles into the nervous system, quietly shaping their inner life. Unprocessed guilt creates an internal freeze response. The avoidant person may feel stuck without understanding why. Motivation declines, clarity blurs, and emotional vitality diminishes. This is not laziness or indifference, it is the weight of unresolved emotion pressing inward. Guilt wants movement, it seeks acknowledgement, repair, or release. When denied to affect these pathways, it immobilizes the psyche. Avoidant individuals often misinterpret this paralysis as boredom, dissatisfaction, or restlessness. They may attempt to escape it through distraction, productivity, or new relationships. Yet no external change resolves an internal stalemate. Guilt that has not been faced remains active, quietly draining emotional energy. The individual may appear functional on the surface, but internally they feel blocked, disconnected from purpose and momentum. This paralysis also affects decision-making. Unprocessed guilt erodes self-trust. The avoidant person may hesitate, procrastinate, or disengage from commitments because guilt undermines their sense of moral coherence. They are unsure of themselves, not because they lack intelligence, but because their inner compass is compromised. When guilt is acknowledged and integrated, it refines judgment. When it is avoided, it clouds it. Emotionally, unprocessed guilt often manifests as numbness. Feeling guilty right. Affect requires vulnerability, remorse, and empathy. To avoid these experiences, the avoidant psyche shuts down emotional access altogether. This shutdown feels safer than exposure, but it comes at a cost. Numbness blocks not only pain, but also joy, connection, and meaning. Life becomes muted, flat, and uninspiring. There is also a physiological dimension to this paralysis. Suppressed guilt keeps the nervous system in a low-grade state of tension. The body remains alert, braced against emotional threat. Over time, this chronic tension contributes to fatigue, irritability, and a sense of being perpetually drained. The individual may not connect these symptoms to guilt, but the body remembers what the mind avoids. Unprocessed guilt can also turn outward. When it becomes intolerable to hold internally, it is projected. The avoidant individual may become critical, defensive, or dismissive of others. By focusing on external flaws, they momentarily escape their own unresolved remorse. This projectio effect damages relationships and reinforces isolation, further deepening emotional paralysis. Processing guilt does not mean self-punishment. It means allowing the feeling to inform growth. Guilt, when faced honestly, clarifies values and restores alignment. It points toward responsibility, repair, and change. Avoidant individuals fear this process because they equate guilt with collapse. In truth, collapse comes from suppression, not confrontation. Emotional paralysis persists as long as guilt remains unintegrated. Movement returns only when the individual allows themselves to feel remorse without fleeing, to acknowledge harm without self-condemnation, and to learn without self-defense. Guilt is not the enemy. Avoidance is. When accountability feels unbearable, the avoidant mind often turns to narrative reconstruction as a means of survival. Rewriting the story is not always a conscious lie, it is a psychological maneuver designed to reduce internal discomfort. By altering the meaning of effect vents, the avoidant individual shields themselves from shame, guilt, and responsibility. The new narrative is not meant to reflect truth, it is meant to preserve emotional equilibrium. After betrayal, the original story is too threatening to hold. The truth requires admitting harm, broken trust, and personal failure. For someone who avoids emotional intensity, this level of self-confrontation feels intolerable. So the mind begins to edit. Details are minimized. Context is exaggerated. Motives are reframed. What was once a clear act of betrayal becomes a misunderstanding, a necessary choice, or a reaction to external pressure. This rewritten story serves a specific purpose. It allows the avoidant individual to maintain a coherent self-image. They can still see themselves as reasonable, justified, or even victimized. The narrative shifts from "I caused pain" to "I had no choice or anyone would have done the same." This cognitive shift dulls guilt, but it also severs the individual effect raw emotional truth. Avoidant individuals often repeat this revised story until it feels real. Repetition reinforces belief. Over time, the original emotional weight of the betrayal is buried beneath layers of rationalization. Yet the psyche does not fully accept the rewrite. On some level, the truth remains known. This creates an internal split between what is believed and what is felt. The mind insists on the new story, while the body carries unresolved tension. Rewriting the story also protects the avoidant person from vulnerability with others. If they admit the truth, they risk judgment, rejection, or emotional exposure. The revised narrative allows them to present a sanitized version of events that elicits sympathy or neutrality rather than accountability. In this way, the story becomes armor. However, this armor comes at a cost. The more the story is altered, the farther the individual drifts from self-awareness. Growth requires accurate reflection. When reality is distorted, sight becomes impossible. The avoidant person may feel stuck, repeating patterns without understanding why. They believe they have moved on, but they have merely moved around the truth. This narrative rewriting also affects future relationships. The avoidant individual carries forward a version of themselves that has not been examined. The same justifications resurface in new contexts, reinforcing avoidance and emotional distance. Each time the story is rewritten, accountability is postponed, and the opportunity for transformation is lost. There is also a quiet loneliness in living inside a false narrative. When someone cannot be honest with themselves, intimacy becomes impossible. Connection requires truth. The avoidant individual may interact socially, even romantically, but something remains withheld. They are guarding a story they cannot fully defend. The rewritten narrative may provide temporary relief, but it does not resolve the underlying conflict. Truth has a persistent quality. In fact, why? It resurfaces in moments of silence, in emotional triggers, in unexplained dissatisfaction. No amount of mental editing can fully erase it. Healing would require allowing the original story to be seen, not to dwell in shame, but to reclaim integrity. But as long as rewriting feels safer than reckoning, the avoidant individual remains trapped in a story that protects them from pain while quietly preventing them from becoming whole. True recovery after betrayal is not achieved through time, distraction, or intellectual insight. It is achieved through humility, truth, and inner surrender. These qualities are not abstract virtues, they are active psychological and emotional processes that require a person to relinquish defenses and face reality as it is. For avoidant individuals, this is the most difficult work of all, because avoidance is fundamentally a refusal to surrender control. Humility asks the individual to step out of self-protection and into honest self-assessment. It means AQ, effect acknowledging limitations, mistakes, and blind spots without self-justification. Avoidant individuals often equate humility with humiliation, fearing that admitting fault will destroy their sense of self. In truth, humility stabilizes identity. It allows a person to say, "I was wrong and I am still worthy of growth." Without humility, recovery remains superficial, because the core wound misalignment between action and values remains untouched. Truth is the second requirement, and it is inseparable from humility. Truth involves naming what actually happened, how it affected others, and why it occurred. It requires resisting the urge to minimize, rationalize, or shift blame. For the avoidant psyche, truth feels invasive. It dismantles protective narratives and exposes emotional reality. Yet truth is not punitive. It is clarifying. It restores coherence between thought, feeling, and behavior. Without truth, the nervous system remains unsettled, constantly guarding against exposure. Inner surface. Surrender is the most misunderstood aspect of recovery. Surrender is not resignation or weakness, it is the release of control over how one is perceived, defended, or protected. Avoidant individuals rely heavily on control to feel safe control of emotions, narratives, and relational distance. Surrender asks them to loosen that grip and allow uncomfortable emotions to arise without immediately suppressing or escaping them. This inner surrender creates space for transformation. When defenses are lowered, emotions can move. Remorse can be felt without turning into self-hatred. Grief can be experienced without collapse. Accountability can be held without defensiveness. These processes are essential for integration. Without surrender, the individual remains locked in a battle with their own inner world. Recovery also requires surrendering the illusion of independence. Avoidant individuals often pride themselves on self-sufficiency, believing they do not need emotional support or relational pair. True recovery challenges this belief. It reveals that healing is relational, whether through honest dialogue, therapeutic support, or deep self-reflection. Surrendering independence does not mean losing autonomy, it means recognizing interdependence as a source of strength rather than threat. Humility, truth, and surrender work together. Humility opens the door to truth. Truth makes surrender possible. Surrender allows humility to deepen. When these elements are present, recovery becomes embodied rather than intellectual. Change is no longer something the individual thinks about, it is something they live. Avoidant individuals often resist this path because it feels like stepping into uncertainty without armor. Yet armor is heavy. It restricts movement and dulls sensation. Surrender removes the weight, allowing the individual to reconnect with their emotional core. This reconnection is not comfortable, but it is liberating. Without humility, truth, and surrender, recovery remains. Incomplete. Patterns repeat, relationships fracture, and inner peace remains elusive. With them, the individual can integrate betrayal into wisdom, transform guilt into responsibility, and move forward not as someone who escaped their past, but as someone who faced it and grew. And so remember this: what avoids truth cannot find peace, and what refuses humility cannot heal. You were not left behind because you were unworthy, but because you were awake enough to face what others ran from. Let them keep their distance if their growth does not depend on their courage. You chose presence over avoidance, truth over illusion, and integrity over escape, and that choice will always lead you forward. Thank you for allowing this moment of reflection to meet your heart. Walk gently, stay rooted in truth, and until we meet again, goodbye.